This meeting is now being recorded.
Okay, hello everyone. We will begin the webinar. My name is Connie Silva Broussard, and I see there are several folks online and hopefully also on the phone that are familiar with me and our project. I want to welcome everyone this morning, afternoon I guess now since it's after 12, and I want to let you all know that I also have in the room with me other members of our team, George Trias, the director of our project, many of you know, Jen DeShazer, Susan Stewart, and Rebecca Anderson. So at different points during this session, you may hear other voices besides mine and our presenters. So just so you know, there's other folks here. There's Rebecca saying hi in chat. And we, as I said, we do have your lines muted, but we definitely encourage you to chat hellos to everyone, questions, comments, whatever you would like to share with the group in the chat box. Okay, and I hear many of folks are still joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and begin. I welcome you to this session, Distinguishing Linguistic and Cultural Differences from Disability. We have Alba Ortiz, who's with us from actually Texas, and I'll be introducing her in just a minute. And I do want to acknowledge that this webinar is brought to you with funding from the California Department of Education that funds our State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. And it's done in collaboration with the Equity Assistance Center at West Ed. Dr. Rose West Owens may actually be on the phone. I hope she is online with us. But again, this was done also with funding on their part, and we appreciate them joining us in this effort. And thank you very much for that. We will actually put, and this we didn't include their website, so we'll put their website address in chat in a minute so you have the opportunity to visit their website and check out their resources as well. They're a wonderful resource here in California. Okay? And I also wanted to give very quickly just an overview of some of our other services that are available through the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. We have ongoing resources and assistance that's targeted to different districts in California, those that are identified as disproportionate or having significant disproportionality. And with those, we do ongoing communities of practice meetings online. Again, some of you have participated in. We also have services to everyone in California, all districts in California, such as this webinar. And I'm going to talk in just a minute about a couple other ones that we have coming up. And then if you want to take a look at our website, you'll see our web address there, www.SPPTAP.org, and you can see some of the other resources that are available to anyone here in California. You're always welcome to contact me or George if you have any questions or want to know more about how we could assist your district. So let me talk just briefly again. This webinar is, as I said, one of the services that's available for free to folks here in California. And we have a couple that are coming up soon, and we want you to know about the dates and the topics so you can mark your calendars. So the first one coming up is on November 13th with Russ Skiba, and that will be on discipline and disproportionality. If you received this message directly from us, you will get an invitation to that as well, so you'll be told when it's time to register. Registration is not open yet. If you didn't receive this directly and somebody shared this information with you so that you could sign up, you can go ahead and either contact us following the webinar, or if you want to quickly put your email address in chat, we will make sure to add you to our list so that this announcement comes directly to you. Okay? Another webinar we have scheduled very soon, February 4th, 2014, we will be working with Stephanie Graham-Rivas, she's from here in California, on implementing a culturally responsive education program. And again, same thing, if you want to hear about that one directly and didn't get this notice to you, go ahead and put your email address in chat and we'll add you. Okay. So with that, we are going to get started on today's webinar. So before I turn it over to Dr. Alba Ortiz, I want to remind you that We have different sessions during this webinar, 5-minute breaks where we'll break for questions. But as she's presenting, please feel free to put your questions in chat. We'll stop at certain points and answer as many of them as we can. Okay? So, thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for joining us, and we'll change cameras in just a minute, but let me first just introduce you to her. Dr. Alba Ortiz is a professor emeritus in the College of Education Department of Special Education at the University of Texas at Austin. Her research and scholarship focuses on the disproportionate representation of English language learners in special education programs, early intervention for ELLs experiencing achievement difficulties, and distinguishing linguistic and cultural differences from disabilities. She is currently a co-principal investigator on a research funded by the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs to develop a response to intervention model for ELLs with reading difficulties. So with that, I'm going to welcome Alba, and we'll switch cameras. And Alba, please make sure to remember to press *6 so that we can all hear you.
Much better.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So I'm really excited to do today, particularly since I first began to be interested in the issue of disproportionate representation when I joined the faculty in the Department of Special Education at San Jose State University in the 1970s. And at that time, I noticed as I began working with bilingual education and English as a second language programs that there was a disproportionate representation of Latino students and students with English proficiency in special education programs, particularly in the area of learning disabilities and communication disorders. And so since that time, I have tried to unravel the puzzle of how you distinguish language or cultural difference from a disability. And I have to say it's probably one of the most complex issues in the field of education. So today I'm going to education. And so one of the things I think I've learned over time is that English language learners tend to be over-identified, under-identified, or proportionately represented in special education, and that these representation patterns really are a reflection not of student characteristics only, but the interaction between the characteristics of the organizations in which they're served, the schools or districts, as well as the type of English language learning program support that they receive, whether it's bilingual education or English as a second language. So that one of the things that we have to do as we address disproportionate representation is to look at schools and districts and programs in addition to looking at and examining the problems that students are experiencing. So it's important for us to ask the question, are we serving it? The reason that this is important is that when we look at English language learners in special education, we find that we have students that are appropriately identified. So in those instances, we don't have a problem. But we often will also find that we have English language learners with disabilities, but they don't have the disability that they have been assigned. So the student may have been assigned the category of learning disabilities, when in reality, the presenting problems are a reflection of emotional disturbances, for example. And then I think that we have probably a larger group of English language learners that have significant learning problems, but these problems can be explained by factors other than the presence of a disability. So, for example, mobility and interruptions in education can have a significant negative impact on student performance. And over time, these students may look like they have a learning disability, but if we can explain the problem in relation to disruptions in education, then obviously the student needs support that does not need special education placement. As we look at this idea of the interaction between the system and the student characteristics, for English language learners, language, of course, is a major contributing factor. So, for example, when you look at these students, the amount of special language program support they receive significantly influences which students are going to be identified and receive special education services. The students that are most at risk are English language learners whose parents deny special language program services. So they don't want their child in a bilingual education or in English as a second language program. So because these students are treated as though they're native English speakers in the context of general education, they're very likely to become special education referrals. Students in English as a second language programs are more frequently referred than students in bilingual education, and that probably has to do with the fact that most students receive pull-out English language development services, and so they spend the majority of their time in a general education classroom where their academic achievement is dependent on how well the teacher can adapt instruction to make it understandable to the student. We also find that there's tremendous variation in representation when you look at English language learners across grades. So if you look at students in kindergarten through 5th grade, English language learners tend to be proportionately identified. We don't have a problem. Beginning with 5th, 6th grade on up the grades, English language learners are significantly over-identified, particularly in programs for students with learning disabilities and speech and language programs. So when we look at our representation patterns, it's important to look at them at the district level, but it's also important to look at them by disability category and by grade, and it's particularly important to look at representation by school, because you'll find that you may have a problem with disproportionate representation, but there may be 2 or 3 schools that really need support because they are making it look like the district overall has disproportionate representation issues. So the question that we wrestle with is, how do you distinguish linguistic and cultural differences from disabilities? But that question is difficult to answer because English language learners, particularly those who are instructed primarily in English, as a majority of students are, the characteristics of those students and students with disabilities are oftentimes very similar. So it's hard to tell when it's a disability or when the language is affecting student performance. In my early career, I was a speech and language pathologist, and so I would give teachers a checklist like this and tell them, look for these characteristics, because if a student makes a lot of pronunciation errors, they have poor language skills, they seem to have a lot of difficulty with vocabulary, they're anxious, withdrawn, confusing for teachers who make the referrals to special education. So in order to decide whether an English language learner should be referred and assessed, we need to understand each individual student's characteristics. However, those characteristics include a really long list, which makes it difficult for us then to make an appropriate decision about the referral. For example, at the student level, it's important to know what their home language context is. We talk about kids as being from, for example, Spanish language homes or bilingual homes. But sometimes students are from homes where the language that's spoken is really a mix of both. They've never really learned a native language or English. We need to know where they live, how present the language is in that community, so that we understand whether it's a context where the student's native language is being maintained or whether the student is in the process of losing native language skills because it's not reflected in his or her immediate community environment. We have to look at language proficiency, but we also have to look at system variables like what has been the nature and the quality of instruction this student has received, how long have they been in a special language program, have they been there long enough so that they have an opportunity to become competent in the native language or in English. And then we have to look at variables like student background, interests, motivations, etc. At the same time, though, it's important to look at the teacher characteristics and whether the student is in a classroom or has been in classrooms over time with teachers that have the necessary training and experience to support native and second language acquisition and to make instruction culturally responsive for the student. We have to understand all of those variables, and oftentimes, because we really don't have enough information about the system and the student, multidisciplinary teams are in a position where they're making decisions without sufficient data. And so then one of 3 things typically happens. They admit students who do not qualify for special education simply because they think that general education no longer works for that student, and they want the student to have access to specialized instruction. So even though the team doesn't think the student qualifies, they can still make an argument for placement. The problem with that is that now we put a student in special education, and we oftentimes put them with special education teachers who have expertise related to disability, but they don't have expertise related to second language differences and cultural differences. So the student may not be well served, and in fact, research that we have done shows that those students in special education over time do worse rather than better. Sometimes the multidisciplinary team will focus on eligibility criteria without considering how language and culture and school history may be impacting student performance. So they may not be adequately dealing with what special education calls the exclusionary clause. They don't have enough data to assure that the problems are not related to language, to culture, or to lack of access to quality instruction. The third thing that happens is that sometimes they do just the reverse. They focus almost exclusively on language and culture and don't consider whether the problems could be related to a disability. And sometimes what happens, for example, is the student in bilingual education will be referred, and the team will reason that it's better to leave the student in bilingual education because the special education teacher is not bilingual. So all of those kinds of decisions have the ultimate effect of denying the student instruction. So as we try to deal with disproportionate representation, the very first question, or the very first thing we have to consider is what is the source of the problem. And one of the ways to think about this is by thinking about the different reasons that students may fail. I talk about these as types of learning problems. So our task is going to be to decide whether we have a type 1, a type 2, or a type 3 student. Type 1 students are students who have learning problems that actually are resulting from deficiencies in the teaching learning environment. The child doesn't speak English, but the school doesn't have a quality bilingual education or English language program. The child comes from a poverty environment. The teachers don't know how to address the low income status factors that are influencing student performance. So these students can learn. The problem is the instructional context in which they're being served is not addressing those needs. So for type 1 students, we really have to focus on the system, the programs, the school, not on the student, because we'll have a lot of type 1 students who look like they have disabilities. A large proportion of English language learners are type 2 students. These are students that have learning problems, can attribute it to deficiencies in the instructional program or deficiencies in the school. It may be that these problems have resulted because the student has been absent so much that they have a lot of gaps in that instruction. But now you have a situation where you have to adapt the instructional context to fill in the gaps that the student is presenting before you consider a special education referral. So for type 2 students, it's clear the student has a problem. The student is significantly below grade level, for example, in literacy. But if the teacher doesn't know how to adapt the instruction to fill in the reading gaps, that student's reading problems is going to get worse over time, and it will begin to look like a learning disability. The third type of student is a student who does have a disability. And so this is one of the federally defined, state-defined classifications. And we define a disability as a condition that presents itself such that the student is significantly different from peers. And so that's going to be a guiding principle. We're going to make sure that students meet the eligibility criteria as defined by the federal government or the state. And we're going to show that the data that we have brought together says it's not lack of quality instruction. The student is significantly different from other ELLs. And so this would be a student that would benefit from a special education referral. I'm going to pause there to see if you have any questions. I think I'm going to go on in the interest of time, and I think that you can certainly interrupt me at any point if there is a question. So keeping that in mind, that you have a task of deciding whether you have type 1, type 2, or type 3 issues, I'm now going to talk about a framework for looking at these issues that helps us think about what kind of interventions we need at what time, or what actions we should take as we go through the process of deciding whether we have a student who has a disability. And in a nutshell, what I'm going to be talking about is preventing problems in terms of the information that I'm going to be providing. So we start with prevention, looking for trying to address type 1 problems. Two key elements of prevention are positive school context and effective instruction. So I'll briefly talk about these. And I'm talking about these because one of the things that characterizes English language learners generally is that large numbers of them in schools are underachieving. And anytime you have a sizable group of students who are experiencing difficulties, then it's more likely to be a system issue than it is to be a student issue. So we have to look at what are the characteristics of the school that the student is in, and are those characteristics conducive to the success of English language learners in general. So at this stage, really our expectation is that 80% address at the level of type 1 problems. So if you look at effective school climates, their characteristics reflect the characteristics of effective schools in general. I'm going to mention just a few that we probably need to add to the formula, or that we want to reinforce because they're so critical to ELLs. One of the first ones is that you have to have strong leadership by the principal. So the principal is the one who ultimately has to assure that bilingual education in English as a second language or English language development programs are effective in those schools, because the principal obviously provides the leadership and the guidance for teachers, so we want to make sure that principals are on board. We want to make sure that the instruction that is being provided is linguistically and culturally responsive, and we want to have close connections with particularly the child's family. One of the things that we have learned over time is that if the parent thinks that the child has a problem and agrees with the school about the characteristics that the child is presenting, it is much more likely that that child will have a disability. In terms of other characteristics, we have to have screening and benchmarking systems. These are going to be critical for native language instruction as well as for English language development. And so we want to have systems in place that allow us to track over time how the child is doing in whatever the languages of instruction are. We have a tendency to do that pretty well these days for academic achievement. We don't do it as well in terms of monitoring language proficiency, and that's going to be a critical component. And so we have to have those assessment systems in place. But one of the key points is that we're going to be looking at student performance over time. And that's critical because when we refer students to special education, we have a tendency to focus on the grade level in which the student currently is enrolled. But in order to understand whether there's really an issue, we have to track back over time to see how the student has been doing across years. We also have to have effective responses to student difficulties, and one of the things that I'll talk about is that includes campus-based problem-solving teams that can support teachers who have English language learners experiencing difficulties that the teacher is having trouble addressing. A key component of a positive school climate for English language learners is a shared knowledge base. So in terms of this knowledge base, what I'm really saying is that everyone in the building, from the principal to the counselor to the paraprofessional, needs to have some common knowledge about who an English language learner is and what kind of supports they need in order to be successful. So that everyone needs to know something about first and second language acquisition. The teachers particularly need to be able to assess conversational and academic language proficiency. They need to be able to tap into students' cultural and socioeconomic characteristics to be sure that the students identify with the instruction. The instructional approaches obviously have to be effective, and again, we need to have partnerships with families. I think that's particularly true when students are in English language development programs only, because oftentimes the parent can provide native language support that helps us help the student acquire English. And then the other is we have to make sure that we identify educators who have deficit orientations towards the student, because what we know is that students will meet educators' expectations, and if the expectations are low, student performance is going to be low. The other part of type 1, addressing type 1 problems is prevention, and a part of that is assuring that core instruction is effective. And again, as I said earlier, core instruction is effective when 85% of the English language learners are meeting grade level expectations. A part of core instruction is making sure that teachers understand language proficiency and that they understand that their goal is to assure that students achieve native or advanced levels of language proficiency in the native language or in English, in that is crucial for academic success. And so when teachers look at a student's language proficiency, they need to have data that allows them to know what kind of support the student needs to achieve that advanced or native-like level. So, for example, if students are in a bilingual education program and they have level 4 proficiency, so it's intermediate or high intermediate, the teacher needs to provide support to move the student to native-like proficiency. If a student has effective native language skills, so they're at level 4s and 5 and moving in the direction of native-like proficiency, and they're performing at levels 1, 2, or 3 in English, that's what tells us that they're an English language learner. When we have English language learners and we're looking at their proficiency in English, we have to make sure that we move them from those lower levels to a level 5 advanced or native proficiency. I'm making this point because most of the time when we get students referred to special education, they're students who are at levels 1, 2, or 3, and they're at those levels in both languages. And so what happens then is that we have to determine whether they're at those basic levels in both languages because they're in the process of learning English or because they have a disability. So now these are students who may actually have a speech and language disorder. In order to figure out which it is, we're going to have to provide some interventions to build the language skills, track student progress in terms of acquiring language, native or English, as a result of intervention. The students who have disabilities are those that, despite that effective intervention, continue to have difficulty communicating or developing the skills that they need to have to communicate orally or to develop skills like literacy. So teachers need to be able to pinpoint where students are in their native language and English, and then they need to track language development over time. So that means that they have to have language data beyond the assessment instruments that states require be administered once a year to determine eligibility or continuing eligibility. So a part of a shared knowledge base for teachers is effective language assessment. You want teachers, as I said, to be able to assess conversational and academic language proficiency, and you want them to be able to do that in the native language and in English. Even if the instruction is entirely in English, it's helpful to know what the student's current native language status is, because if a student has poor native language skills, that's going to make it more difficult for them to acquire effective English. They need to be able to reflect on their receptive and their expressive skills. They have a tendency to focus on how well they talk, but how much they understand is probably more important, because students can understand more than they can express. So teachers should establish baselines, native language and or English, and then track how well the child is acquiring whichever language or languages we're instructing longitudinally. So if you're the third grade teacher wanting to make a referral because of speech and language problems, you need to be able to track back and say, well, what was the child's language proficiency like when they started school? Have they made progress over time? And if they haven't, you're going to be looking for evidence that teachers provided interventions to help them overcome communication difficulties. Now, I'll mention very quickly some ideas about what teachers should be doing in terms of language assessment. Obviously, we're required by law to do a home language survey, but periodically, and particularly if we're going to refer a student to special education, we should update the using the home language questionnaire to see whether the language context in the home has changed, so that when begin school, you may find that they're at home with two monolingual parents. It may be that the parents divorced, mom remarries, husband speaks English, and so it's important to know what the current language environment is, and it's particularly helpful, I think, to know whether there are siblings in the home and what the language proficiency of siblings are, because oftentimes students receive a lot of their language exposure through their siblings and peers. Then we want teachers to periodically, over the course of the year, do some informal language assessments. So they might do an oral language observation so that they're rating how well students understand, speak, the quality of their vocabulary, their grammatical and syntactical accuracy, their fluency, and they're wanting to make note of what issues students seem to have in the context of informal conversation as well as academic discourse. And so teachers can do observations, or they can take a brief oral language sample, listen to it, and rate students' competencies. Beyond that, though, they also need to be able to assess academic language proficiency. And so teachers need to understand that what they're trying to do is to gauge not only whether students understand and speak well with others, but whether they are following classroom discourse. And so to assess receptive skills, you can have students retell stories, or you can do a class dictation. To assess expressive skills, you might ask students to tell you a story, or to fill in a closed task, or fill in a blank passage where a message is being communicated. Because those are the kinds of tasks that students routinely do in classrooms, and the answer, or what you're trying to get an answer to, is the question of whether or not they have enough language to benefit from academic instruction. So can they listen to a teacher deliver a lesson and understand it? And that's what the kind of information you get if you do a brief dictation or a story retelling task. So informal language assessments are crucial. When you look at the language data, then you're wanting to ask whether the student has advanced proficiency in at least one language. If he or she doesn't, then that's going to be a focus of your instruction. If you're doing bilingual education, if you have a bilingual education program, then you have to recognize that oftentimes students come in with good native language skills, but they come from lower socioeconomic status and backgrounds. And so even though their native language is great for the context of home and community, it may not be great for school. And so you have to build native language proficiency in order for them to do native language tasks. In the second language, obviously the same is true. There the task is a little harder because you have to develop conversation and academic proficiency, but you have the dilemma that students are having to do academic tasks in English while they're trying to acquire the language. Then you have to look at the tasks the kids are being asked to perform and ask yourself, does the student have the language that is required to perform or to do this activity? If the answer is yes, the student doesn't seem to be an issue of language, then you have to ask yourself whether the student has had enough instruction to be able to do that task. So what is the prior instructional experience, or what is the prior experience with that particular topic that's being discussed? If you look at for instruction in terms of the content areas, then, as I said before, your expectation is that 85% of students are on grade level 80 to 85. And so then you can scan these characteristics very quickly. You're wanting to make sure that in addition to having the screening and benchmarking and progress monitoring tools in place, that teachers are providing instruction to develop higher order skills as well as basic skills. So they need higher order instruction and explicit skill instruction as well. So because those are the kinds of things that they ultimately are going to be tested on. And then the delivery of instruction has to be a language lesson, so that whether kids are getting native language or English language development, language has to be a component of that instruction so that kids are acquiring key vocabulary, that they understand the concepts that are being presented. We should try to make sure that instruction is thematic so that they get to use the language that they are working with in the literacy area, in the science and the math areas as well. Students have to have a lot of opportunities to interact with others, and I think that it's particularly important that students have an opportunity to interact with native English-speaking peers when our focus is on developing English proficiency. So if we use the specials like art, music, and PE to provide that interaction, we want to make sure that those teachers have that shared knowledge base and that they understand that they may be teaching music or art, but they're doing a language lesson as well. I've already mentioned family involvement. Families can support student learning in the context of work that we've signed, but I think also they're very helpful in terms of exposing children to language, and one of the things that we want to make sure is that parents of English language learners do not begin to believe that they need to switch over to English because we're trying to switch English. They should only do that if they themselves are proficient English speakers, which is not typically the case. So then, as we're looking at student progress, we're wanting to ask ourselves whether we have groups of students experiencing similar problems. And so if you have a group of students who are in a teacher's classroom and they are really having difficulty acquiring literacy, then we want to take a look at the appropriateness of the curriculum and the quality of instruction, because otherwise we're going to be overwhelmed with having to provide a lot of individualized instruction to a lot of students. And so anytime there is a group that is identifiable who's having difficulty, that suggests typically that there's a problem with the curriculum or the instruction. So let me pause again.
Okay, Alba, I'm going to go ahead while people are writing in maybe additional questions. We do have a few that came up while you were speaking. And first, let me check in with Alina. You asked a question a while back. If that question has not been answered, go ahead and just put that in chat, and we'll add that and make sure that she covers that. But Alba, the other two questions I want to bring to you, one is Alejandro asked, he said, this may be out of the scope of this presentation, but is there a resource available that you can direct us to on how to redesignate ELL students with severe cognitive delays through the IEP process?
You know, that is probably one of the least researched topics in the field, and I can't direct you specifically to some resources, but I do think that there are some guidelines that can be followed such that you keep a few concepts in mind as you're trying to make that determination. First and foremost, it is what is the exposure, what language exposure has the child had in the home, and how does the student respond to intervention, native language or English. So let me give an example. Increasingly in the field of autism, we're beginning to see studies that speak to identifying the language preference that students with severe disabilities may have. Students that's just finishing up a dissertation that's trying to address that. The thing I think that's really crucial is that the language of the home is probably going to be first and foremost in terms of making the determination of which language the child is going to benefit from, and these are probably students that are not going to be redesignated. So in one sense, because they typically don't develop enough language to communicate effectively so that you could say that they have the proficiency that's required in either language. And so I'm not really sure that redesignation is a critical question for these students, because in reality I think we're going to be trying to figure out what language can the student respond to and use regardless of whether it's a native language or English. But I guess the brief answer should have been, that's an open question. We don't have an answer for how you do the redesignation.
Thank you, Alba. We also do have one of the other districts, Angela from San Diego, who offered a resource. I guess San Diego's recently developed an alternative assessment for reclassifying ELs with disabilities, and she's willing to share that. So she's listed her email there in chat. Thank you for doing that, Angela. Another question, Alba, from Greg is, what does benchmarking and progress monitoring look like for L1, especially in an ELD-only model?
I don't think you do benchmarking and progress monitoring in the academic areas in an ELD model, because, you know, achievement is the product of instruction. So if students are not getting any native language instruction, then you're not going to be benchmarking achievement over time in the content areas. What you can do is monitor their progress in relationship to English language development. And so that's where I was suggesting that teachers, that you have the assessments that are typically required by the state to establish eligibility, and so that gives you kind of a static view of where students are. And teachers can even begin with that assessment data. But then over the course of the year, they should be doing those language observations. They could do some informal vocabulary measures in relationship to the content that they are teaching. They can do storytelling, dictation. So a series of informal assessments that they do every 6 weeks, for example, to make sure that students are progressing in terms of the development.
Okay. And then Brenda asked specifically, what assessment tools do you recommend in order to identify differences between ELLs and students with disabilities? So any commercial assessments?
You know, why don't we hold that question for the special ed part?
Okay.
I think we'll talk about that there.
Okay, good. We'll hold on to that bit. One more, and then we'll move on, and that is, Zaida asked, what is the source of the 85% reference to the percent of ELs at grade level? Is this a national average or percentage?
That really is a reflection of the kind of guidelines that we're using in the current context of response to intervention as a way of preventing disproportionate representation. So when we look at students, we say that the curriculum is appropriate if the majority of the students are succeeding. And so 80 to 85% of all students should be meeting whatever the standards are that we set for that, for their grade level. We should only have 15 to 20% of students who are struggling with the content areas, and that 15 to 20% are the ones that we're going to focus on to try to get them back on track or make a special education referral decision. So the 85% is what I would call the national standard that we use in a response to intervention model that says instruction is not effective unless most students are succeeding.
Okay, thank you, Alba. Let's go ahead and move on, and again, folks, continue to put your questions in chat. Thank you.
Okay, so now we want to look at early intervention, and what we're trying to do is to focus in on those students who are experiencing difficulty. So in relation to the question that we just talked about, we're now focused on that 15 to 20% who continue to struggle despite effective instruction. And so when you move to type 2, what you've really said is we don't have any problem with the curriculum and the instruction that we are providing ELLs generally. that instruction is good, and despite the fact that it's good, we have a few students, or it could be 15 to 20%, obviously is a significant number, but we have students that require more than core instruction to make it. So now what we're wanting to do is to identify those students to make sure that we've differentiated the instruction to address their particular background characteristics and needs, and now we're going to design supplemental small group instruction to address presenting problems. And so one of the things that's important is to stress that that the instruction is supplemental. It does not replace the core. So students continue to receive core literacy instruction, for example. And then what we're trying to do is to find time during the day to provide some additional support for that student, review our instruction to try to plug in the gaps that they seem to be experiencing. So in trying to identify which students those are, we need to make sure that we routinely have structured data meetings where grade level teams or other school teams come together to review the performance of students within classrooms and within grades as well as across grades. So that we're wanting to, again, identify whether we have so many students that seem to be having the same problem that it may be that there's a gap in the curriculum or in the instruction that we need to fill because there are so many students. And when we identify those 15 to 20% that are at the lowest levels of the achievement levels, now we're going to talk about, well, how can we provide small group instruction for these students, and how will we monitor their performance? So teachers become critical in that they're the ones that are going to provide the supplemental instruction. They need to understand the data that they're working with, because we test students so often in the context of the instructional delivery process that we should be using that data to organize students into groups of students with similar needs, and then the teachers target those and they provide explicit systematic instruction in the targeted skills areas. So if the student seems to be comprehending effectively but is really having trouble with phonics, and those are the skills we target. If they seem to be having difficulty with comprehension, we focus on comprehension, but we also think again about the question, do they have enough language to be able to understand the task. And so really what we are talking about is really at the within the grade and within the classroom. So we expect teachers to deliver the core instruction. We expect teachers to be able to identify the kids at the bottom of the achievement continuum in their classes and to provide supplemental instruction for those students in their classrooms, unless there is an effort at the school level to share kids, so that you might have first graders who are experiencing problems and they are grouped together so that one teacher provides instruction for a group of 6 kids who are having problems with phonics, while another teacher provides instruction for kids in the comprehension area. But most of the time we're wanting to think about how we can keep students in the classroom so that we're not interrupting the instruction day for them unnecessarily. So then we're going to monitor progress, and so you conduct periodic assessments in relationship to the skill that you are assessing, and so you can have checklists, brief classroom-based assessments where you're making the determination whether the student has acquired the skill that the teacher is teaching. And then you want to move students out of those groups back into core instruction as quickly as possible. So if with the supplemental instruction they meet the goal, they return to core instruction only. If they're approaching the goal line, or they're close to it, then you continue the intervention until they have met the goal, and then return to core instruction only. So these students are going to be receiving core instruction and supplemental instruction until we've resolved the problem. If we provide the instruction and they continue to experience difficulty, then we need to go back and look at what is it about the instructional intervention that we're using that we might need to change. And so, for example, it's not unusual that teachers work on literacy and they keep working on comprehension, but the real issue is that the student doesn't have enough of the language associated with the content of the lessons to be able to function effectively. So the teacher needs to reinforce language instruction at that point. And so then teachers provide supplemental instruction in the context of the classroom or sharing students, as I indicated earlier. And now you may have some students that, despite that supplemental instruction, they are still experiencing significant difficulty. So now we need to adjust the intervention, make it more intensive, and so we can do that by reducing the group size, for example, extending the amount of time that students are provided the lesson. So we're wanting to make sure that we are really targeting to the individual student or to a very small group of students to see if we can resolve the difficulty. When students don't benefit from the small group instruction with 3 to 6 students or 1 to 3 students, and these are the students that we're going to think about referring to special education or to supplemental instruction. And so I'll talk about that in a moment. So when students don't make it with the group instruction, small group instruction, then we typically have 1 or 2 alternatives. And another program, typically outside of the classroom, or a special education referral. Now, I think it's important to know that we're not trying to prevent referrals. I mean, you could refer a student, 6 weeks into the school year. What's going to be critical is what information do you have to support that referral, and what evidence are you presenting that it's not instruction or lack of access to quality instruction that's at the heart of the problem. And so we oftentimes will use problem-solving teams that come together, meet with teachers to try to resolve or to try to address the students' difficulties. Sometimes the problem-solving teams will help the teacher design other interventions that he or she might try to see if the student will do better. Sometimes the problem-solving team will suggest that the student go to a reading specialist or math specialist, someone outside of the classroom, or this problem-solving team as it may decide that the student really needs to be referred. And I think one of the benefits of problem-solving teams is that then the decision to refer is a group decision. It is not an individual teacher decision. And again, we're not ever going to discourage teachers from referring, but these cases are so complicated that we want more than one lens on the problem to make sure that we're not overlooking some things that could easily address the student's difficulty in the context of general education. So when we talk to teachers of English language learners about problem-solving teams, they oftentimes don't utilize those teams because they don't think that the team has enough expertise on English language learners, or they go to the teams and the teams don't help them address interventions. They don't help them design interventions. So the problem-solving team oftentimes becomes the last place that you go before you refer the student to special education. And so the problem-solving teams are really designed to help with type 1 and type 2 issues. Type 1 issues when it's really that the problems in core instruction isn't working effectively, or type 2 students who have significant difficulties, but they're not disabilities. So we want to make sure that the problem-solving teams, if you have them in place on your campus, have that expertise and about English language learners, and they're about designing interventions in the context of general education, not only making a decision as to whether a student should be referred. Let me pause again and see if we have questions.
So, Alba, I think at this point the couple questions that we have are tied to what you're going to be covering in the next section, which is the modifications for special education procedures. So unless folks have a pressing question right now, we will have more time for question after your next section, and I think that's where the rest of them apply right now.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so what we have been talking about so far is that the key to determining whether a student, an English language learner, has a disability lies in general education, bilingual education, English language development programs. And until we engage our general education peers in the design and implementation of instruction and progress monitoring, we're continuously going to have students that teachers want tested because they're not meeting expectations. So now I'm looking for a small group of students who are referred to special education. If the percentage of students in special education that we expect to have in special education is 10 to 13%, depending on your state, then that's really the percentage that we're looking for. We don't want any more than that in special education. And we want them to be spread out across all of the special education eligibility categories, because the majority of ELLs are classified as having learning disabilities or speech and language disorders. They tend to be under-identified in the category of emotional disturbance, attention deficit disorders, hearing impairments, etc. So we're wanting to make sure that we identify the expected number, but that percentage is spread out across all of the disability categories. And so for students now that we are considering referring to special education, we want to think about what does our special education process look like. And the first thing that we have to do is to link the prevention and early intervention efforts to the special education referral. And so the Special Education Referral Committee will meet with the teacher and other representatives to review information that's been gathered during the prevention and early intervention phases. And what the referral committee has to be asking is, could we explain the child's problem on the basis of a factor other than the presence of a disability? So that it's going to be then important to know that core curriculum is effective, the teachers are providing quality instruction, they're monitoring student progress, they've identified students that are struggling, and they've provided intervention, and those interventions haven't worked, small group and smaller group. And so the referral committee has to look at that information. Then if they want to go forward with a referral, they want to develop a set of questions or a list of unresolved problems, things that they don't understand about this student. Because what we want to make sure is that assessment personnel don't simply pick up a battery of tests and administer them to meet the eligibility criteria. The student has had a lot of support. It hasn't worked. That's why we're at the stage that we are. So the issue goes beyond test scores, really needing to understand what the problem is. So if we request the full and individual evaluation or the comprehensive assessment for special education, then what we're wanting to make sure is that the assessment person who has that shared knowledge base I talked about earlier, they know native and second language acquisition, they know what would be effective instruction for this student, and they're going to need to know that if they're going to recommend interventions if a student does have a disability. So the assessment person sits down and they have to decide how they're going to conduct the assessment to answer the questions of the referral committee and to meet the state or federal eligibility criteria. And so then they're going to select a battery that allows them to reflect on the student's current native language and or English as a second language proficiency so that they can assess academic progress or whatever the area is that's of concern, whether it's behavior or others. And so here I'm going to say what in some ways is for me to say, and that is that in many ways it doesn't matter what assessment instruments are used. I'll talk about that in a moment. They have to be assessment instruments that the assessor is comfortable with. I have to say that even in this day and age, we still don't have assessment instruments that are really appropriate for the majority of the ELLs that we're talking about. So what's going to be probably more informative in the assessment process is the results of those formal assessments in comparison to the results of informal assessments. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So obviously there are going to be some guidelines that we use. I'm sorry, let me go back. There are going to be some guidelines that we use when we select instruments, because the law requires that we use instruments that are appropriate for the purposes that we're using them. The law requires that they are administered in the language and languages that give us the best information upon which to make the eligibility determination. That you have to limit bias in the assessment process. So when you look at the assessment instruments, the critical issue is, do we have the best instruments possible? And so in the area of intelligence testing, for example, you can decide that assessing intelligence using nonverbal measures is more effective than assessing using verbal measures if you're doing the assessment in English. But I guess my main point is that I trust assessment personnel to select the instruments. I trust them to know the limitations of those instruments, and I would hope that they would find other sources of data, such as that comes from informal assessments, to corroborate the results of the standardized instruments. Part of the determination in terms of the ELL has to be based on what they know across languages. So too often what we do is we assess in the native language, we assess in English, and then we give a score for each language. And when you look at scores in each language independently, you oftentimes are underestimating the student's ability. So if I give a vocabulary test in English and I give a vocabulary test in Spanish, what the child's vocabulary ability is really a reflection of all of the words that they know or understand across the two languages. So we need to give credit for what they know, and so I'm not suggesting that you pool the scores, but I am suggesting that you describe the patterns of performance, trying to capture everything that the child knows regardless of the language in which they know it. And so that's going to be critical. And so if, for example, you give a speech and language assessment and you discover that the student has very low speech and language scores, then you're hoping that the teacher has been administering instruments. Someone is asking me a question about the SOLM, the Student Oral Language Observation Matrix. If the teacher has been using the SOLM across the school year, then the teacher will have identified speech and language difficulties as well. If the teacher hasn't noted them using that observation, maybe a problem with the formal instrument results. So the two need to be consistent in order for us to have more comfort in the decision that we're making. So when the assessment person has the results, one of the first things that they're going to do is look at the results in relationship to what were the stated referral concerns. And one of the things that we really need to look at is how assessment data are used by multidisciplinary teams. We study this issue a lot, and so what we find things like the teacher referred the student because he couldn't read very well. The test that was administered showed that the child was within normal limits, so reading wasn't a problem, but math was identified as a significant concern. So the child is put in special education because he qualified in math, not in reading, but he gets both math and reading instruction in the special ed context. And so that to me would be not an appropriate practice. And so we're not just trying to identify any disability, we're trying to identify whether the child's problems that the teacher and the problem-solving teams have identified reflect themselves in the formal and informal assessment. So then the assessment person should state the basis for the recommendation that they're making, and they should use multiple data sources. And so those multiple data sources are going to be those informal assessments administered by the teacher. They're going to be the results of the screenings and benchmarkings that are conducted across the content areas. There's going to be parent reports. The parent information suggests that the parent is seeing the same problem in the context of the home and community, because in the end we have to verify or confirm that this is a problem that exists 24 hours a day. It's not one that exists during the school, the time the child is in school. And so the problem has to manifest itself across context. The assessor obviously will be thinking about what kind of recommendations can I make to help the teachers, special education and general education teachers, program for native language and English language development. Because in most instances, because the students tend to have mild disabilities, they spend the majority of their time with general education teachers, bilingual ed or ELD teachers. So now we're wanting to look at indicators of disabilities. So as the assessment person tries to make a recommendation about eligibility, as the multidisciplinary team tries to make a decision as to whether the student is eligible, they should be looking for indicators such as the ones that are listed here. I already said multiple data sources corroborate the difficulties. The assessment results, the teacher assessment data, the problem that the teacher's seeing has been one that has been there over time across grades. Parents see the problem. We're wanting to look at the students' cultural characteristics. Are they consistent or inconsistent with those of peers? If they're consistent with peers, it's not a problem. Teachers, for example, sometimes don't know what the cultural characteristics are, and so they make judgments about student performance even when they're seeing the same type of behavior across many students. For example, teachers will say, it really irritates me that ELLs have a tendency to say, teacher, teacher, maestra. And what the teacher may not realize is that maestra is a very respectful form of address in Spanish, and we don't need to add a name to it. And so that's why students oftentimes call their teachers miss, and don't attach the last name. So if lots of students do that, that should be a clue that it's not a cultural deviance. How does the child look, or what do the child's native language or English skills look like in comparison to peers from similar backgrounds? If it's English language instruction only, how does their English language compare with other ELLs who have been receiving ELD support for about the same amount of time? So again, we're looking for behavior that is deviant from that of peers. We have a student more likely to have a disability if they've been consistently enrolled, and even though they've been in school every day and have received quality instruction, they're not making it. When you have students that are very mobile, you want to make sure that the student has been enrolled in that school long enough for intervention to have taken effect. So if you see a history of interrupted education, you don't want to initiate a referral until you've done intervention for an adequate amount of time to determine that the student isn't going to benefit from core or small group instruction. You want to look at significant life events. So sometimes, for example, we see students that early in their school careers suffered a trauma or an accident, and that issue has not been adequately addressed. So, for example, you may have a child who lost a parent in the second grade, had been doing okay until then, and then all of a sudden they begin to have achievement difficulties, and that becomes a pattern over time. So what you're looking for is if the child was having an emotional reaction to a life trauma, what do we do in terms of counseling, helping the student address that issue? what kind of general ed interventions have been tried, and the interventions have to be specific to the presenting problem. We want to look at whether we see behaviors that are associated with the suspected disabilities. So if I'm considering a learning disability, for example, I should be looking for students who seem to know things today but forget some tomorrow, that they have problems understanding or doing the task, even though we've done some dynamic assessment, taught them the skill, and then retested it. And so students who have disabilities have those kinds of issues. You continuously have to keep going back to establish the skill, and they have a difficult time, and that's why we have to compensate with the support for the disability. I've already said that the comprehensive evaluation should corroborate teacher and referral concerns, and at the end you have to just say, is there any way that we can explain the problem other than the disability? And the reason you want to ask that is that once you attach a disability label to the student, if it's not correct, it's very difficult for the student to overcome that label. For students who do have disabilities, we're going to design an IEP. Students should have native language and ESL goals, again, dependent on the type of program that they're in. We're wanting to think about how we can transition students across languages and from the special language programs to general education. The IEP has to clearly specify who's responsible for instruction in what language. And so I think in a nutshell what I'm saying is you can't program for dual language instruction if you have an IEP that was designed for monolingual language instruction. So you want to look at the characteristics of your IEP. Then the instructional characteristics for special ed are the same ones that you would see in core instruction. What's going to be different now is that we will probably have to address modifications, accommodations. Some students will need social skills training. They may need support to transition from school to post-secondary education or into the community. They may need technology. And for these students, it becomes particularly important to have continuous family involvement. So now the services that the students receive have to be coordinated across bilingual ed, English language development, general education, special education programs, and services. And so kind of in summary, we've talked about the characteristics of a framework for assuring that instruction is appropriate for ELLs. And so we want to make sure that those components are in place and that we're continuously driving our decisions with data that reflects the student's language proficiency as well as their academic achievement. And so what that oftentimes means is that we have to provide professional development for all of those involved. And so we want to take stock, how are we addressing the needs of ELLs, general ed, and special education? What are our strengths and our needs? We need to have specific written policies because otherwise each school and each person interprets the rules from their own perspective. That's why you see differences in representation patterns across districts and across schools. And so when you assess the practices and programs, you can identify the areas where improvement is needed. And I guarantee you that what you will consistently find is that it's not a special education issue, it's a general education issue, because too many ELLs underachieve, and that underachievement over time begins to look like a disability. Too many ELLs don't receive effective native language or English language development, and so that reflects as a speech and language problem. So we want to make sure that we provide training for everyone to share consistency of policies and practices. There was one question that I saw that I wanted to comment on, and that is whether native language assessment is important when kids have been in English language development, primary English language instruction, for a long time. And again, I want to reiterate that language assessment is probably good over time. Because when you get the referral, one of the questions that you have to answer if the student is low in both languages is whether they have always been low or whether they had strong native language skills and over time lost those skills, whether they have had instruction in English that has been appropriate so that their English language trajectory is increasing. And you can't answer those questions unless people have been monitoring what's happening to students in the language arena. You're not going to assess achievement if the student hasn't been receiving instruction in that language. I will say that a common mistake I think that assessment personnel make is that they assess in English only after students have been exited from bilingual education programs. And so when kids have received native language instruction, it is important to see, where they are, even if they haven't had that instruction for a period of time.
So George just put other questions in chat. We did make sure to save a little bit of time here at the end, so we still have Alba for another 9 minutes if folks have additional questions. And I know there were a couple more in chat. I want to make sure that they were actually covered during the last part of the presentation. So if they weren't, go ahead and put them in chat again and we'll respond. Or ask Alba to respond.
I think there was a question thinking back about, what assessment instruments. And so as a guiding principle, I would say that assessment personnel, if students are receiving native language instruction, should try to find instruments that assess skills comparably across languages. So native language vocabulary assessment with a similar English language vocabulary question. We have a lot of instruments that we can use for kids who are receiving Spanish-English instruction. And so what we're trying to do is if the students are getting native language instruction, to assess in both languages so that we can compare the performance across languages. You can't have disability in English if it's not in the native language. If students are receiving instruction in that language. By the same token, you can't have a speech and language disorder in English if you don't have it in your native language.
Okay, Alba, there's also a specific question from San Francisco USD. It says, can we have some resources for L1 and L2 IEP goals?
I can make those available to you. There are actually a lot of companies that do IEP goals and objectives, and they then provide particularly Spanish alternatives. But I would say that the best source of the IEP goals and objectives are related to the state and district curriculum in the content area that is problematic, because you have the standards that students are being required to meet, and then you identify where students are in relation to those standards. And so the IEP goals reflect the additional support that students need in order to be able to achieve those. I guess it's a personal bias, but too oftentimes when we resort to an IEP bank, for example, we begin to lose sight of the need to really look at the individual student needs. And that's particularly true for ELLs, because every ELL presents a different picture, and so you really have to try to sort out, who the student is and what their needs are and what their backgrounds are in order to pick out those goals.
Okay, Alba, we have now a little list of questions here, so let me go through them in order. What place does CBM have in EL development and or eligibility evaluation?
I think that's the tool that you use for progress monitoring. So you can use curriculum-based measurement or curriculum-based assessment, and so those are going to be the brief assessments that you use in relationship to the instruction that you are providing. So they have an important role, and it's important that we think about how to design those for the native language and for English. So they're part of the progress monitoring.
Okay. And then Guillermo asks, are there any recent developments in non-biased assessments that you know of or recommend?
I don't really know those, except that I would say that response to intervention is probably the newest kid on the block, because if you really implement a response to intervention approach where you're really focused on the quality of instruction that students are receiving, then when you get to the testing part, that, you can actually place students into special education in some states anyway, without conducting a formal assessment using a test. And so I think that's probably a major contribution of response to intervention, that it says you can't just test. You have to look at how the student has been instructed and the progress that they have made in the context of the general education classroom. And then your assessment should say, yes, I see the same problem. I can verify it with the instrument. And so beyond that, I don't think we really have made tremendous gains, except that there are probably more tests available for in languages other than English. But oftentimes the native language assessments have exactly the same problems as English instruments. So, for example, I think it's really hard to test language using a test, because language is interactive and there's a lot of two-way communication that has to happen. And so to do a quality speech and language assessment, you assess the student, but you also assess the skills of the person talking to them, because sometimes low language performance is not the student's problem, it's the person that they're speaking with. And so, yeah, I think it's very hard to do that with assessments.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from Mendocino, and they're kind of related, but I'll voice them separately. It's, how do you recommend assessing students in their native language if the SLP doesn't speak that language?
Almost impossible to do. So I guess I would say a couple of things. One is that districts should carefully consider contracting with bilingual speech pathologists in order to do that, to provide an effective assessment. Absent that, there are a lot of assessments that bilingual people who are bilingual could administer and actually score with training. The skill that the speech pathologist has is the interpretation of the results, not so much the administration, but the interpretation of the results. And so that's where, if you have a speech pathologist who is really has expertise around issues like second language acquisition, they can use that expertise as they're considering the results of the assessment conducted by, a teacher, a paraprofessional, or someone who is bilingual. They can talk through those results to see whether they're really indicative of a problem or not. And again, I think it's very helpful to talk to the parents, because if the parents say, you know what, I have trouble understanding my child, and I don't, they have trouble understanding me, and this child is very different from my other children, then those are the multiple indicators that you're using to try to make the determination. But it's very difficult for people who are not bilingual to conduct the assessment, and so you're really wanting to pull together the expertise. And that's one of the reasons the multidisciplinary team should have experts on ELLs present, because they can reflect on whether the performance seems to be problematic or not. But trying to do teams of people, monolinguals to support bilinguals to support monolingual assessment personnel is certainly worthy of consideration. And bilingual education teachers can play a helpful role in that process.
Thank you, Alba. Our time is really, we're at the end of our time, and we do still have some questions coming in and some comments. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for being here, and Alba especially for your time. We really appreciate your expertise and guidance that you provided today. I want to remind everyone that Alba also provided 3 different articles, and they were in the link that Jen sent to everyone, where you could get the PowerPoint as well. But there's additional reading materials for anyone who's interested. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead with the questions that are remaining, and we will put them in a document for Alba. Perhaps we could get some written answers that would be helpful, or of course Alba has her information there and you could email her directly. And again, I want to thank everyone for being here, and I'll say goodbye to everyone. Thank you very, very much.